All right, I believe we are live. It is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. Let me know in the comments if you can see me and hear me. Always like to check that. We've got a whole bunch of people joining us live. I'll give you some shout outs as we get in. But for those of you who are watching the replay, we want to get right into it. Today is going to be basically like a master class on metering. Knowing how to use your meters properly, I'm going to argue, can make recording, producing, mixing, and mastering not only turn out better, but be more fun. Is that possible? Is this too bold of a claim? Metering makes it fun. No, it's true. And I know it sounds really weird. Like, how could looking at your meters and like caring about your metering and your levels make things more fun? That sounds like the nerdiest, most awfully, like, ridiculously not fun thing I can do. Spending time thinking about my metering. But no, if you get your metering right, you can think about metering and levels less, which is going to be the whole entire point. All right, let's get right into it. There's only a few types of meters out there. It seems like there's dozens upon dozens of types of meters. But in reality, there's only like 3 different things that you can meter. You can meter loudness. You can meter correlation, meaning the difference between one or more channels, how in phase or out of phase they are. And those are the only 3 things that meters are really going to tell you about. If you think you can think of something else, let me know in the comments down below or in the chat if you're on the live feed. But the reality is you can meter 3 different things. And I think anything you come up with is going to be a subset of one of those 3 things. I'm actually able to share my screen. This is my first time sharing a screen in a live feed. So let me know if it shows up. Do you guys, let me know in the chat, see my Pro Tools screen? Now, if you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, which I know thousands of you are, don't worry, I'm going to make all of these descriptions make sense verbally, so you don't have to see the stuff. But for those of you who are watching the video version, there'll be some visual aids in here, and we can bring up meters that we can look at together. All right, our first most important type of meter is the VU meter. And these are old school meters. And I really want to start at the beginning because it's a very good place to start. I think it's, when it comes to understanding meters, we want to like go back in time and figure out, all right, how are people using these early on, and how did they evolve, and why are they the way they are? And that's going to help us get a sense for how to better use our meters. And I'm also going to show you some tricks that you can do with VU meters that you can't do with other types of meters. There's some mixing tricks and some recording tricks you can do with these meters to help you get better levels and potentially better balances and better mixes. Now, VU meters weren't the very, very first type of meters ever invented, but they're probably the first really important and useful type. And when I play some audio through here, we're not going to hear it. We're just going to look at the meters. And for those of you who are listening to the audio-only version, you can just listen to me talk about it. These VU meters are going to kind of dance in a way that is kind of rhythmically in tune with the music. And of course, I just lost my feed here. I had everything routed properly, and it looks like everything unrouted. Hold on one sec. This is one of the problems with being live, potentially. Darn. Well, first thing that's gone wrong on a live stream. Maybe I can edit this out in the non-live version. But these meters basically dance in time with the music. And VU meters, they're going to give you a sense for the average level in any instrument or any mix you put through it. What they're not going to respond to are transient peaks. And that's the big problem with VU meters. VU meters are basically one of the best things, potentially, for showing you average levels over time. But VU meters aren't enough to tell us everything that's going on with our audio. They're going to be very good at capturing low frequency content, but they're going to be really bad at capturing high frequency content. So one of the first types of meters that got added onto these are peak meters. A little red dot here on the side that is going to light up every time we reach a hotter level with our transients. So usually these kinds of VU meters are giving us a sample of something like 400 milliseconds. So we're taking a period of something like 400 milliseconds and looking at our average over that period. And this is really good for things like average level of vocals, average level of bass, average level of kick drum, and they're going to be good at showing us the relative volume of elements like that. But they're going to be terrible at showing us the levels of things like cymbals, hi-hats, shakers, and really transient percussive elements. They're not going to be as good at showing us the level, the true audible level of a snare drum as they are on a kick drum. So one of the first things that was added to VU meters was a little red peak light that would just show you if some of those quicker things that a VU meter can't catch was getting so hot that all of a sudden you'd be clipping. The cool thing about VU meters, though, is that they allow you to really just focus on the average. I'm sorry, this is my first time doing one of these live streams. I'm realizing you can't actually see my plugin. You can only see my edit window. So let me see if I can fix this. Oh, man. Can show my mix window, can show my edit window. Let's see if there's a way to show my whole Pro Tools window. Give me 1 second, I'll see if I can fix this. I thought I was going to have all these great visual aids for today's episode. Give me 1 second while I fix this, clean it up, and see if I can get you to see the right feed, because it's only showing you my edit window and not currently my plugins. I can show you my mix window. I can show you my edit window. Let's see if I can show you my whole entire screen. Give me 1 more second here, guys. I appreciate the patience. My first time trying to do it with the screen on a live stream. So you get to see me crash and burn in person. Oh, I wonder if we can go over to this tab and then I can show you some images here. Let's see. Sweet. You should now be seeing at least images that we can look through together. All right. So the first type of meter, VU meters, are going to allow us to see averages of things like kick, vocal, bass really easily. They're not going to catch things like the transients of snare drums, transients of high percussion elements. So the next big type of meter that was designed would be something like this, a PPM meter. And these PPM meters are going to have really fast time. So instead of looking at a 400 millisecond attack time, all of a sudden we're looking at 10 and 20 millisecond attack times, maybe as short as 4 millisecond times, potentially even shorter than that. But I'd say 4 to 10 milliseconds is a normal window for a PPM meter. And this is going to do a really good job at showing us our peak levels and how high those are going. They're not necessarily always catching our fastest peaks, but they are giving us a sense of the really kind of fast changing percussive elements in a mix. But they're terrible at showing us average levels, the ways that our ears perceive them. I'll give you a couple ideas about how you'd use each of these meters. The VU meter is a beautiful thing if you're shooting for a target of 0 VU on a VU meter. That is usually going to correlate to negative 18 dBFS on your digital meter in Pro Tools. What does that mean? Well, 0 VU on this VU meter, that was the target back in the analog domain. If you shot for 0 VU, you'd know you have a signal that was healthy enough that you wouldn't be buried in the noise floor, but wasn't so hot that you'd get heaps of distortion. Now, in digital, it's a little different. Our scale has 0 at the very top, and that is the level that you should not pass. Do not get any louder than 0. But we have tremendous amounts of dynamic range in the digital realm. So you don't need to shoot for 0 in the digital realm. In fact, if you do, chances are you're overloading your converters. If you're not using 32-bit files, you're going to have clipped digital audio. There's all sorts of problems aiming for 0. So where should you aim? Like, what should be the average level that you're looking to get on a digital meter? And something like 0 VU on an analog meter is still a good place to look. And what does that equate to on the digital meter? Well, about 2/3 of the way up your digital meter, you usually get to a spot that a VU meter is going to show you as being 0 VU. That's the calibration between analog and digital for most converters. Not all of them, but a good target is if you still use a VU meter for things like vocals, for things like bass, for things like kick drum, for things like distorted guitars. If you aim for around about 0 VU, you're going to get to a pretty decent level where you're not recording things so incredibly hot that you're going to be distorting going in. But the beautiful thing about digital is you don't have to worry about the meters too much, because the noise floor is so incredibly low. If you were to record way, way quieter than 0 VU, it's not a problem at all. You'd really have to be recording down like 60 dB below 0 for it to really be a problem. So honestly, my advice to you when it comes to recording in a digital format is, shoot for 0 VU or significantly quieter than that. So it can be handy to pull up a digital VU meter. But you also can use your standard digital meters built into something like Pro Tools and just look at something like 2/3 of the way up as being a potential target. So if you're hitting right about here, I mean, it's even marked in Pro Tools. You can see it when I hit play, that when we get to this brighter green zone, like that's really as hot as you ever need to record. And the most important thing to do on the recording end is just, in my opinion, when it comes to digital, is record things like you're mixing them on the way in, where if you keep all of your faders at 0 at unity gain, the mix kind of works and just sounds good. And you don't have to worry too much about how hot or how quiet you are. Now, with that said, there are things you can do at the mix stage with VU meters that are going to potentially help you bring your mix together faster. I'm going to talk about that in just a second before we get into the other types of meters and how to use them. But the one other thing I want to say about recording is those of you who are working in electronic music, and electronic music production, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can offer to you is turn down your damn samples when you import them into your digital audio workstation. Using something like clip gain in Pro Tools, allowing you to turn down the level of your samples, can be a much better way to mix, or a much better way to gain stage your initial mixes. One of the most annoying things to have happen in a mix is if you brought in all of these samples and sample-based music that are all peaking out at 0 dBFS. They're all the way up the digital meter scale. Now you're in this place when you're mixing where you kind of have to like turn everything down. And you're in this place of turning everything down to make the balances work. This is, in my opinion, from a workflow and experiential perspective, so much less fun than turning things up. So I recommend doing gain staging with things like clip gain if you're bringing in samples that are extremely hot, or if you have soft synths that are putting out extremely hot levels, to clip those things down, trim their output down, still use it as if you're in the analog domain, and think about leaving headroom on each channel, just so when you get into the mixing stage, you can go ahead and turn things up. And it's just more fun than having to obsess about your meters. So just spending a tiny bit of time at the beginning of the session looking at your meters to make sure that you're not overloading your master fader allows you to pay a lot less attention to your meters as you go along. All right, so that's our first major type of meter, VU. Last quick trick that you can do with VU meters And I wanted to show this to you guys on Pro Tools, but apparently I'm having a glitch with that. I haven't completely figured out OBS, and I can't actually show you my plugins, only my Pro Tools screen. One thing you can do with meters, VU meters, is, let me switch my view back here for you so you can see my Google window here. One thing you can do is, if you are trying to figure out how much low end you should have in your mix, and your room is lying to you about how much low end there is in your mix, a VU meter can help you there. A frequency analyzer can also help you there. But I find that a VU meter is one of the simplest ways to dial in, and for people who get too confused by frequency analyzers. So a mixing trick you may have heard of several times in the past would be something like this, or maybe you haven't heard of it. But so for some of you, this would be a refresher. For some of you, this would be totally new. If you target around 0 dB VU with, say, your kick drum, you're probably going to end up with a mix overall that is a bit too hot, and you're starting to clip your master fader, and you're starting to have to mess around with things and turn things down so you're not hitting all of your plugins on your master bus too hard. But if you were to try to mix so that your kick drum is hitting somewhere, say, -3 dB, -6 dB, that could be a good foundational level for your mix. And then when you bring in your bass, you could have that bass by itself hitting something like the same, -3 or -6 dB. But the relationship is that if you can get both the kick and the bass to independently be the same level on the VU meters, chances are you're going to have somewhat relatively well-balanced low frequencies, more so than you can do by ear in a poorly treated room or on headphones that don't tell you anything about the low frequencies. Is this the ideal way to get your low end right? No, but it is a trick that a lot of producers, engineers, and mixers have relied on. Another variation of this idea is you bring in your kick drum, so it's at -3 on your VU meters. And then you bring in your bass so that the kick and the bass combined are hitting around 0 on your VU meters. The peaks of those might well be higher than 0 on the VU meters, but those initial peaks might not be picked up by the VU meters. And then you can bring up everything else around that kick and bass. And that's a simple way to kind of gain stage things and make sure that the proportion of the low end in both kick and bass are somewhat comparable. This is not a substitute for mixing, however, because it doesn't take into account how bright your kick is compared to your bass. And at the same reading on a VU meter, your kick may sound way more apparent than your bass because it's a lot brighter and has more upper mid frequency content. So this is where we get back to an idea that we've talked about in prior episodes, where if you're in a badly treated room or if you have headphones that aren't giving you accurate information about the low end, spend a lot of time focusing on getting just the mid-range of kick and bass right. And then once you have the mid-range of kick and bass right, then you could check them on something like a VU meter and say, do they have a similar average energy level in the VU meter? And if not, the low end of one relative to the other might be out of whack. That's a piece of advice that's been shared a lot, but I think there's even better ways of going these days. And one of the even better ways is frequency analyzers. So next major type of meter after our loudness type of meters are frequency analyzers. Before we get too deep into them, there's one more major type of level meter we haven't talked about. We talked about our VU meters, which are great at censoring average levels, really bad at showing you instantaneous transient peak levels. We talked about peak meters, and the earliest peak meters would just be a light that lights up and says, you're peaking, signal's too hot. And then the very last type of meter in this general area is something called a PPM meter. And this is kind of like, gives you a really fast average, something like 4 to 10 milliseconds. And that's what a lot of people think of when they think of the term peak meters, these PPM meters. But all of them are basically showing you level, and they're showing you level either a big average, VU meters, or a short average, these PPM meters, the LED meters that you find commonly in things like Pro Tools and other DAWs. Another step forward after that were meters that were more trying to show you loudness, overall loudness meters. And these basically combine both of these two ideas. They're going to give you an average level reading, and they're also going to give you a transitory peak level reading. Some of the first types of meters were called durometers that did this. And let's see if I can go back and show you a durometer here. Right here, we've got an example of some durometers. This is some of the ones from Waves. And these are the kind of meters we had in the mastering studio when I first started mastering an analog system. And these kinds of loudness meters would show you both an average and they would show you peaks. And basically what makes this kind of digital meter a loudness meter is that we're slowing down the response of it a little bit. So it's giving us more of a long average. So we have one main set of lights that's going to respond more slowly over a longer window. And then we have another light that's basically showing us our peak level. So we have both a slow meter and a fast meter combined. Now, the next step up from this, and you see this in a lot of meters today, Bob Katz was a big proponent of this, a mastering engineer who wrote a book on mastering. He came up with this kind of K metering idea where, hey, the idea was to get a true look at how loud our signal really is. We have to start doing some weighting and start to realize that our ears don't hear all frequencies equally. So if we start doing some weighting on our metering, maybe biasing towards high frequencies and recognizing that upper mid frequencies are going to cause greater levels of perceived loudness at the same amount of amplitude compared to low frequencies. So basically, brighter, generally speaking, sounds louder. And if you take away a lot of high frequencies, you need a lot more energy to give the same perceived loudness. And a lot of loudness meters try to bake that into it. And here's an example of a K meter. It's basically the same concept as these early durometers, but we're trying to take into account the weirdness of the human ear. Let me switch back over to my main view here. So this is totally new for me, this having visual aids in a podcast. So I hope this is useful for you. I had even fancier visual aids in mind and in store for you guys, but I need to figure out OBS even better before I can do that. So my humble apologies. Now, there's something I like to say whenever I screw up on a live stream, which has happened more than once, which is that if you already thought I was competent and then I screw up in front of you, it's supposed to humanize me and make you like me more. So let me know in the chat or the comments down below if you like me more now that you've seen me screw up royally, totally live in front of you. But the next type of meters I want to go into with you guys are frequency analyzers. That's our next big thing that we can look at visually. It's frequency. And then after that, it's going to be spatialization. And we'll get into that in some more detail in just a second. Let's look at some frequency analyzers together. I'll bring these up on screen. And I'll bring up an article that I wrote a while back where we looked at a whole bunch of frequency analyzers. And we'll grab some of the images from here. Let's switch back over. All right. So, frequency analyzers. The earliest types of frequency analyzers looked a little something like this. These kind of graphical frequency analyzers. We're just plotting out a bar for each frequency. These are the kinds of things that started to first really appear in consumer stereos in the 1980s and were super high tech. The kinds of frequency analyzers you're probably more accustomed to seeing would be something a little bit more like this. This is a totally free one that you can get from Blue Cat. It's their Freak Analyst. I believe this is one of their free plugins. The ones that I often use, if you have Plugin Alliance, their SPL Hawkeye is absolutely awesome. It has so much metering in it. They have great frequency analyzers there. The Isotope stuff has great frequency analyzers built in. But with frequency analyzers, the idea is it is showing us energy in different frequencies. Sounds obvious. But how can this benefit you? How can you use them well to help you enhance what you're doing, and how can you use them badly? First of all, I would say at the recording stage that frequency analyzers are not something that I'm inclined to mess around with or recommend that you mess around with. Even at the mixing stage, I think that sometimes they can lead you astray on individual instruments. A lot of modern EQs have frequency analyzers built in. Things like Isotope's Ozone EQ, FabFilter's Pro Q3. And while this can be useful in helping you visualize what's going on, I'd actually argue that when it comes to mixing, the less visualizing you do, the better. The more that you kind of mix blind without looking at stuff, I think the better decisions you're likely going to make. However, when it comes to the overall tonal balance of your mix, and when it comes to mastering, frequency analyzers, in my opinion, become indispensable. And they help you answer questions about things like low frequencies that you can't hear especially well on your system. The ways that I use frequency analyzers in mastering is to help me zero in on what spot I need to adjust. And the way that I recommend using frequency analyzers is to first decide with your ears what, if anything, needs to change. And then use your frequency analyzers to zero in on the exact spot that needs changing. So for instance, I might feel like the low end is a little out of balance, and there's the fundamental in the kick is just a little prominent compared to the fundamental in the bass, and they're just out of balance in the lows. Now, where is that in the kick? What is that area in the kick that's just making it take up too much room in the low frequencies and mask the low end of the bass? Is it 80 hertz, 90 hertz, 100 hertz? I'm pretty good at guessing, but I'm not that good at guessing. You look at the frequency analyzer and there's a hump there. It says 95 hertz. Oh, that's probably where it is. Every time the kick hits, I'm seeing this big hump at 95. I've already decided for myself that something needs to happen in the fundamental of the kick. And there it is. It's got to be that right there at 95. Or really a fundamental on a kick is probably lower than that. That would be a first harmonic on a kick. A fundamental on a kick might be even lower than that. Depends on how the kick is tuned, though. But now we're digressing, which I can do. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for on frequency analyzers. Fundamental on a kick's probably more like 40, 50, 60 hertz. That would be a better example. But maybe there's this thing happening at 100. Maybe there's the fundamental at 50, and there's that first harmonic at 100 hertz, and that's the one that needs to be brought down, and it's masking the bass. Or it could be the other way around. It's just, I feel like the bottom register of the bass is a little bit missing. Where is it? What's the range of the lower register of the bass in this song? Oh, it looks like it's dancing from between 80 to 120 hertz. In this particular song, that's the area in the bass where we've lost something, and I want to try to bring that forward. Same thing with the high frequencies. There's something annoying happening on the top end of the vocal. Where is it? Is it 8K, 9K, 10K? Oh, there on the meters, it says 7.5K. So that's where I'm going to target my de-esser. So using the frequency analyzer to help you zero in on an exact spot that's like messed up or too much or too little, I think that's the way to use them. To first decide with your ears and then check on the frequency analyzer. In mixing, I would say kind of becomes the same type of thing. Use them to solve problems. And one of the most common places you might look at this in mixing is going to be, say, on vocals, to help you find the exact frequency where you have to eliminate sibilants, or to help you find the exact frequency range where there's too much chestiness happening in a vocal, to give you ideas of where to boost or cut once you've already identified an issue. And you can also do it on your mix bus. If you're in a room where you're not sure if what the low end is telling you, is accurate, go ahead, use your frequency analyzer, because that frequency analyzer is going to help you decide, do I have enough 60 hertz overall, too much 60 hertz overall? Am I boosting too much low end on my bass and kick? Chances are you're in a room or a set of headphones where you cannot make accurate decisions about low end. But something that you can do is listen to your mixes, and here's the important part, a ton of other great commercial references in your style, and look at them on a frequency analyzer. And you'll start to develop a sense for what really good sounding mixes in your style look like on the frequency analyzer, what the overall frequency distribution tends to be like. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to copy this by eye, but it can give you an idea of, oh man, there's way more 60 hertz at the bottom of my mix than there is on like every single reference I'm looking at. Maybe that's telling me something about how much 60 hertz I'm pushing. And maybe I've got to take the time to listen to more references in my room so I know what a really good amount of 60 hertz sounds like in my room. So again, helping to reveal problems in that way. One last type of meter that I want to talk about with you guys is the very last kind of meter that I can think of. And this is going to be a phase correlation meter, more or less. Let me bring one of those up for you to see it. Go back to my screen here. Here's a phase correlation meter. This is one, I believe, built into Pro Tools. And you've probably seen these before. Isotopes Imager has a great version of this. The SPL Hawkeye plugin. Let's type that in so I can show you its layout. I was planning on bringing it up in Pro Tools if I had gotten that to work properly in OBS here, my video software. This one has a very similar phase correlation meter. And then Isotopes Insight has a different default type of phase correlation meter. Let's bring that up. Oh, you know where they have it? They have it in the Isotope. Here's a free plugin you can check out. The Isotope Imager. There's a totally free imager from Isotope. I prefer even more so their imager that's built into the Ozone platform, because it does allow you to break up your stereo separation into multiple bands. But the imagers, the kind of correlation meters can look like this, or they can be on a dot plot. And they're basically going to tell you the difference between left and right. So they're going to show you in what ways the left and right channels are similar and in what ways they're different. And these types of phase correlation meters, are they useful? I think they're useful for two reasons. One, double checking whether the stereo spread in your work is anything like the stereo spread in your favorite commercial releases. This is, again, a place where I think they help you make a better study of references and see how your mixes sound compared to references. So this is one way to use them. Really bring some of your favorite releases into your DAW and develop a sense memory for what they tend to look like on the phase meters, on the phase correlation meters, and say to yourself, oh, the really narrow mixes, here's what they look like on a phase correlation meters. The really wide ones, here's what they look like. And you might be surprised to find that some of your favorite sounding commercial releases are not very phase coherent. They're wildly different in left to right. And this often comes from not necessarily just setting stereo image enhancers and wideners to stun. It comes from panning choices much of the time. So that's one thing that I think these phase correlation meters are awesome for, is allowing you to double check what width looks like in your favorite releases and help you just think more about how width sounds by having a visual aid that helps you to kind of develop a sense memory for how stereo spread works in your favorite releases. And when you've gone through that exercise of listening to a bunch of your favorite releases, listening for how things are placed in the stereo field and looking at them on one of these meters, and then doing the same exercise with your own work, you'll start to develop insights into how you are using panning compared to most of your favorite releases. It makes you just develop this sense for how are my favorite mixers treating the stereo field? How are they panning things? How hard are they panning things? How much are things phase aligned and centered? Or how much are they willing to kind of push the edges and draw my ears outwards? And am I doing way too much of that compared to my favorite releases, or way too little? Chances are, if you're just starting out in mixing, you're doing way too little. That's what happens most of the time when people start out. They're afraid of going really wide meaningfully with panning. And I have some podcast episodes that are all about that. But there's also the chance that if you've gone through that phase and now you're like, oh, I'm going to take the advice of people like Justin who are telling me to push it wider, that maybe you're going through this stage where you're pushing things so incredibly wide that you're starting to get to this place where you're lacking a cohesive center. And studying your work and others work on these phase meters. I think that's one of the best uses of them. The other two best uses of them are just to diagnose problems, just like a good visual double check. Like there have been times where I've literally been mastering a track and I'm like, man, I keep on EQing this thing. It doesn't sound very good. I wonder what it is. Like, is there some problem in the mix? Like, what should I tell them to? It just doesn't have this impressive, immersive feeling. And then I look over at the phase correlation meter and I'm like, they sent me the mix in mono. No wonder. Nothing I'm doing to this is making it sound right. It's because the whole thing is mono, and I look over the phase correlation meter and it's telling me so. So that's another way that I've used these things. And you can use them on single sources as well to give you those kinds of insights. But those are really the only ways that I personally use those meters. I love looking at them in mastering, but it's just as a check, a reminder to make me think about what the overall stereo impression feels like and how the panning choices are being handled. Let me know in the comments down below or in the chat if you have even more uses for them. But I think those are the big overall takeaways. Metering, for all the many types of meters there are, it seems like there's countless types. They're all basically the same. They can show us level. They can show us level broken down by frequency. And they can show us the difference between the left and right speaker. And that's it. When we get to even more complex types of meters, like these kinds of waterfall plots, those are just another way of visualizing a frequency-dependent level meter. Now, within each of these types of meters, there's one other variable, and that's what is the sample time for the level that we're looking at. So VU meters use a relatively large sample time. That's why they're so good at tracking averages, because you're looking at a window of something like, say, 400 milliseconds on the average RMS VU meter, where you're looking at something like 4 to 10 milliseconds on your average LED PPM style meter. Some even better types of meters have both. They'll have one little line that shows you the fast average, 4 to 10 milliseconds, something around there, and they'll have another line that maybe shows you something like 300 or 400 milliseconds. But you can also take samples over an even longer period of time. And that brings us to our last, most important type of meter that people have the most questions about, and that is going a little deeper on loudness meters. Loudness meters, or LUFS meters, as a lot of people call them, show us loudness units. They're showing us how loud our track is overall, often over the length of the entire track. So when a service like Spotify or Apple Music tells you to shoot for a LUFS rating of -14 or -16, that's how hot you want to get. That's the loudness that you're looking for. When they say that's the target, they mean that's the target over the entire song averaged. And that's what's called an integrated reading. But there's also ways to use these loudness meters over much shorter periods of time. You can be looking at momentary loudness over just a handful of milliseconds, or short-term loudness, maybe a few hundred milliseconds. So there's many different ways to get a loudness rating. So you might have a track that is -14 LUFS, but you might have some sections that are as loud as -12 LUFS, and some sections that are as quiet as -16 LUFS, or maybe even quieter. But when you average out the level over the entire song, you get a particular integrated loudness reading of, say, -14 LUFS. So this is one of the reasons why two tracks that are both at the same loudness rating on your meters can sound differently loud. This is why even when your songs get onto a playlist with other songs and all the songs are turned down by the same amount to get to roughly the same integrated loudness reading, each of them can sound differently loud. And there's two big components here. One component is level isn't the only thing that goes into loudness. Although these loudness meters try to compensate for the way that our ears hear things, they don't necessarily do it exceptionally well. Still, even after taking into account that our ears sense, say, upper mid-range more readily than they do low frequencies, even once we've taken that into account with a loudness rating, brighter tracks still tend to sound louder. So that kind of compensation is not perfect. So that's one aspect. But another aspect is you might have one track that is, say, -10 LUFS or -8 LUFS. It's really loud. And on Spotify, well, it's not even really loud. Really loud is like -5 LUFS. But you have a track that's much higher than the recommendations from Spotify or Apple Music. And that track gets turned down. But in being brought up to that level, there's so little dynamic range that even the quiet sections and the quiet moments between loud hits also sound loud. Whereas you might have a much more dynamic track where its average loudness, once everything gets turned down, is the same as the track that was squished to -8. You have your track that's open and dynamic at -14 or -16. And even when that -8 track gets turned down to be the same nominal loudness as your more quietly mastered track, that level matching is not perfect because the quiet sections and the quiet moments in the hotter, more squished track are going to sound louder than the quieter moments and the quieter sections in that quiet, more quietly mastered track. So long story short, just because you mastered your track to -14, someone else mastered their track to -8, and theirs got turned down to -14, it does not necessarily mean that your tracks are going to sound equally loud. There might be brief moments in that -14 track that actually get hotter than any of the brief moments in that used to be -8 track. But those brief moments are not what give us our overall impression of loudness. Averages over sustained periods of time do that. And one of the best types of meters for tracking exactly that is a VU meter. And chances are that if you look at both of those types of tracks on a VU meter, the track that was mastered hot and then turned down hits one spot on the VU meter and stays kind of pinned there, while the track that was mastered to be much more dynamic bounces around like crazy on that VU meter. Now, that's not necessarily bad, and I'm not necessarily saying you should master your tracks way hotter than Spotify recommends and Apple Music recommends, although practically all of your favorite commercial releases do. Very few records are ever mastered to -14 or -16. It's just to say that there are some potential benefits of going louder than the streaming services tell you when you're mastering. And ultimately, you want to let your ears be the guide, not the meters. But if you spend a little bit of time looking at your meters earlier on, you're going to have a much easier time producing, arranging, recording. And if you spend a little bit of time looking at your meters at the very end of the process, it can help you kind of quell some second guessing about just how loud should this release be. Take some of your favorite releases, bring them into your DAW, and look at them all on loudness meters. And I think that you'll find that there is a range of acceptable loudness in your genre where records sound right. And chances are it's not exactly what the streaming services tell you to shoot for. I could go into that in so much more detail, but I think we've covered a heck of a lot for today. Thanks for bearing with me with my technical difficulties today. It was absolutely great to have you guys here. Thanks so much for joining me. A couple of quick notes that I want to give you is that first, if you want to go really deep into levels and loudness and learn so much more and really hear this stuff and make some sonic changes with me to some actual tracks and really get a sense for how loud you should be pushing things and what kind of differences things like limiting and EQ make when it comes to loudness, and you want to see a whole bunch of dancing meters, you can check out some of the full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs or Mastering Demystified or Compression Breakthroughs. I think Mastering Demystified is really the one where we have this module that we added on by popular demand, where we just look at loudness as it applies to several different genres and look at just how loud you can master tracks, how loud you should master tracks, and how to keep from making things sound terrible when you go hotter, and also how to keep things from sounding off by being too quiet. So you can check any of those out. They got a full 30-day money-back guarantee on all of them. Also, big thanks to Sound Toys. If you didn't check it out, we just had a great conversation come out with these guys. You can check it out right here on this channel with 3 people in the world of film scoring, 2 really accomplished film score composers and 1 really accomplished film score mixer. You can check it out. It just came out yesterday here on this YouTube channel. I think I have it out there under the title of Film Score Secrets. Really fun, great conversation with Ryan Miller of the band Guster, Dan Deacon, and Jason LaRocca. They've worked on all sorts of films for Hollywood, for Amazon, for Netflix. And if you guys are looking to getting into scoring for picture or scoring for games, that is a tremendous one to check out. So big thanks to Sound Toys. They helped sponsor that one as part of their Sound Design Week. They are having a huge sale right now. You've heard me shout them out constantly on the podcast because they've been sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. And if you want an excuse to buy some stuff this week right now, they got some big discounts for film scoring and Sound Design Week. Check them out over at soundtoys.com where you can try out anything they make for free for 30 days. Also, I want to give you something free for getting this far. It is GPU Audio. They're hooking you guys up with a free convolution reverb if you're on Mac, and if you're on PC, a free convolution reverb and a free modulation suite that has things like chorus, phaser, flanger, and they all run on the GPU inside your computer. Check them out, gpu.audio/SonicScoop. That's gpu.audio/SonicScoop. Thanks so much for joining me. We had a bunch of great members joining the chat. Ant-Man Felix, Music 7 Studios, Tortugola Productions, Legacy Supplies, a whole bunch of you guys, Skeleton Pete, members. And if you want to become a member, you can. Right now, there's a super cheap introductory price for members. And you get access to once monthly live Q&As with me, and we also do regular mix critique sessions where we'll listen to your tracks together and give you precise ideas on exactly how to fix whatever is wrong with your tracks or improve whatever is right with your tracks. You'll get not only constructive criticism, but actual specific ideas about the specific things you can do on your specific mixes if you want to participate in those mix critique sessions. You can hit the join button at the bottom of any one of the videos on the YouTube channel for that. One quick note. That will not work if you are on Apple iOS apps. For those of you on Apple devices, I've got one, you can't join from the iOS apps. I think it has something to do with how much Apple Store charges for subscriptions and things like that. So for there, if you're on an iOS app, you just got to go to a browser, whether that's on your phone or iPad or on a desktop, and you can join there. Well, thanks again for joining me. I'm going to check out all the comments that came in via chat. And I'm really looking forward to seeing exactly what you guys had to say about the way that you use these tools. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.